Here's a quote from Jung that I think of as kind of stoic-like. He says, "Life calls us forth to independence, and anyone who does not heed this call because of childhood laziness or timidity is threatened with neurosis. And once this has broken out, it becomes an increasingly valid reason for running away from life and remaining forever in the morally poisonous atmosphere of infancy." So that's super interesting because once you feel neurotic, once you're like, oh, I'm anxious, then you're literally like, oh my God, I can't do anything because I'm anxious.
Rather than just trying to avoid the anxiety, figure out what the anxiety is telling you. That so often happens with those feelings that are uncomfortable. How often someone just sort of punishes themselves because they're feeling shame. When that's not really the function of shame. Shame's trying to tell you something. It's trying to say, you got to do something with this talent. Otherwise, you're just going to remain anxious. Not, well, I can't work it because I'm anxious. The other way around, the anxiety is telling you need to.
Let's expand on that at least a little bit of what are we talking about with creative imagination?
What I mean is the capacity to really, in a robust way, imagine possibilities as if they're actuality.
Mm-hmm.
If I can't do that, the likelihood of me changing anything in the stream of my life is very limited, right?
Totally.
So, and I do think that much of media plays off that. So, you're getting lifestyle of the rich and famous, you're getting celebrities, you're getting that kind of thing. But you're not getting much that's food for creative imagination. How would I go from here to there? Why would I want to go there? How could I imagine being there? What would that actually look like for me? What would it feel like? And imagination is key to this, I believe. I really believe that the imagination is the workshop, of possibility.
Oh, I love that. Imagination is the workshop of possibility. I totally agree with you. And I feel like, first of all, it's very difficult to do something if you haven't imagined doing it first. And if you have something difficult to do, try imagining it as vividly as you can, and it will be easier. And John, I have people who come in who say, "Well, I don't know what I'm going to do," and they have that kind of energy, and I feel like their talents pressing to come forward. And I say, well, sometimes I'll invite people, say, "Well, imagine what kind of life would you like in 5 or 10 years?" And some people can, oh, well, I can, and they can really picture, but a lot of people can't. And they'll shut themselves down. And I'll say, no, no, no. First, let yourself have the fantasy. And I'll say, what is the fantasy? And they're all embarrassed. I'm like, no, no, no. Tell me. You're dancing on a rooftop in Ibiza. Go ahead. Go there. Really let yourself have the fantasy. And then, yes, eventually there will be the compromise with reality. And what's the version of that you can have? But you've got to have the fantasy first. So I really agree very much with that.
That's also very bound up with the feeling function, as we were talking about earlier, right? Because the fantasy or the imagination is bearing the values, right? So that's what the feeling function is trying to express also through that. I noticed that when I ask someone to imagine it, oftentimes they could still only do it like it's an intellectual, like they don't get their feeling involved.
Yeah.
But without the feeling of it, you're not really fully imagining it. Like you say, it's not the vivid kind of imagining that you're looking at. But if you can do that, I not only think that it gives you a sense of possibility, but if you keep imagining yourself in that situation, often certain abilities that are latent begin to develop so that you can actually do it.
You're cultivating them.
Cultivating. It's exactly what you're doing. Yeah, as you read that a lot about people who have been very successful in life, they often have a very robust creative imagination and often imagine themselves in that situation. And by imagining it, it's as if psyche responds by saying, "Oh, that's what you want? Well, look, then let's start developing this. Let's start developing that."
I feel like we're treading dangerously close to what is that called? That manifesting.
Yes, the New Thought tradition and things like that. That's right. Yeah.
But in a way, is one of the possibilities, is that it's sort of a magical thinking thing. And I can waft off into some sort of fantasy of there above, the bluebirds sing, versus the depths of yourself and the rest of yourself. Where I'm thinking about this is the parallel with active imagination, of connecting with your own inner ability to have feeling and to let the unconscious speak while you have a dialogue with it. So you sort of immerse yourself in something in your own interior that is also real. So you're going in and deep not out and away. And that is very much at the heart of Jungian analysis anyway, is what's our relationship with the unconscious, with psyche?
And I think what you're saying also really increases agency, which is also associated with the Stoics,
Yes.
right? So that, because it's when you can have that kind of connectedness to your own potential, and then imagine it also becoming realized in the outer world, that then, of course, your agency is also activated.
So it's the both and, right?
Yes.
It's the feeling and the creative imagination coupled with this sense of agency and I want to say like responsibility. So here's a quote from Jung that I think of as kind of, stoic like. He says, "Life calls us forth to independence, and anyone who does not heed this call because of childhood laziness or timidity is threatened with neurosis," which is what you're talking about, John, when people come into the office and they have their antsy. And once this has broken out, it becomes an increasingly valid reason for running away from life and remaining forever in the morally poisonous atmosphere of infancy. So that's super interesting because once you feel neurotic, once you're like, oh, I'm anxious, then you're literally like, oh my God, I can't do anything because I'm anxious. And we see so many people like that who are suffering because they can't get out in life and do what they want to do because they're anxious. And really, it's almost like, well, if you could just make a move, you might be less anxious.
Well, that's right. That's right. It's understanding those kinds of things as indications of, rather than just trying to avoid the anxiety, figure out what the anxiety is telling you.
Yeah.
That so often happens with those feelings that are uncomfortable, whether it's grief, whether it's anxiety, whether it's, feelings of shame, how often someone just sort of punishes themselves because they're feeling shame. Well, that's not really the function of shame. Shame's trying to tell you something. And it's as if, yes, you're taking anxiety seriously insofar as it limits you, but not insofar as it's telling you something, which
Right.
is really what the anxiety is for. It is part of its own adaptive thing. It's trying to say, you got to do something with this talent. Otherwise, you're just going to remain anxious. Not, well, I can't work it because I'm anxious. The other way around, the anxiety is telling you need to.
We started off by saying, gosh, this is really so up in the culture. There are podcasts, there are all kinds of, there's an Instagram page, there's the Daily Stoic. I forget what that is. And if you look, I will shamefacedly admit that I'm somewhat obsessed with the Amazon bestseller ranks. But I will tell you that Marcus Aurelius is like, I don't know what it is today, but it's usually like number 600 out of all the like millions of books on Amazon. And I think it's pretty much been a bestseller since it was published, but especially now, it's very, very apropos. And I think, and I said in the beginning, I think it's compensatory. Is I think in this culture now, we get messages that, oh, you're anxious. Well, here's a pill, and maybe don't take that class if it makes you anxious. Oh, you're anxious. Oh, then here's a what do they call those things where, if you're in high school, you get a special education plan. If you're anxious, don't go to class. Go to the nurse's office. You can lie down. We there's been a kind of cultivation of fragility, actually, in some of the ways that our culture has responded. This whole idea about trigger warnings, which have now been shown to be actually unhelpful. It's like, well, no, maybe you need to, pull yourself up a little bit and do something difficult, which I think, as per that Marcus Aurelius quote, it's like that is what Stoicism urges us to do. And it's what Jung urges us to do as well. It's like figure out what you need to do and then bloody well figure out how to do it.
And the good news is really it is so empowering. You have the power. You have the power. It's right there in you. A little bit like Dorothy in the red shoes. Go for it. Come on. You can. Have a life.
Instead of looking at the obstacles to your agency, look at how your agency can overcome the obstacles, how much better that you feel about yourself when you can.
Yeah. And when we do better, we feel better.
So what have we not hit here, John, in terms of Stoicism or its link with Jung? Did we miss anything?
There's a way where a classical psychoanalysis and Stoicism are kind of opposites, like insofar as, original psychoanalysis was in large measure a reaction against industrial society where instincts and affects were to be suppressed because you're supposed to be working in the industrial machine, right? And so I'm not even sure if there hadn't been industrial society, a psychoanalysis would have actually been necessary. But in any case, Stoicism is instead saying, control them. Sometimes it's maybe overly strong about them. Sometimes maybe it treats instincts and feeling life too much of the same, that they're all problems, and so just be very rational. But as you're saying, there is something compensatory about it in an age where people's affects just seem to be vomited out all over the place. And it's such a chaos of affective life because of this problem of uncultivated affective life. When it's not cultivated, then it has a way of just projecting itself into the world, and people are just trying to react against it. So I also see this increase in Stoicism in the last 50 years or so as being partially a reaction against that, which increased, I think, during the pandemic. I think when people didn't know what to do with themselves, to read meditations, for example, was actually kind of consoling to figure out and gotta kind of keep doing that. But what I think you both have highlighted, what's really key there is that the kind of responsibility we have for our inner life is very central to Stoicism. I wouldn't necessarily limit that to rationality because, as I've said, I think the language of cultivation tells you cultivate your abilities and your powers and so forth, includes your capacity for feeling and relating to values. That's a hard thing to do in a consumer capitalist society where there is no such thing as value. It's just whatever you want. And I shouldn't have to, make myself any different for it. So that's kind of a hard lesson. So part of this compensatory move of Stoicism is serving a good purpose. Some of it maybe not, because it could be saying, yeah, your feeling life doesn't matter. Your instincts don't matter. Well, that's not, I think, the right point either. So it has maybe an ambiguous relationship to psychoanalysis, and certainly in highlighting responsibility for inner life. That I think is crucial. But inner life is more than rationality. But honestly, in our society, if you cultivate that, you're already on a good track.
Right.
The capacity to take a little distance from one's emotional life, so that you can't cultivate it if you can't learn how to take that space between your feeling and interpreting what it means and so forth. That classical psychoanalytic idea that you have kind of three options of your affective life: repress it, act it out, or learn how to contain it so that it symbolizes. That's not exactly Stoic, but there is something that resonates with the Stoic thing, where I learned to neither repress, which maybe a negative Stoicism would do, or just kind of vomiting out that I'm saying I think is all too frequent. And understanding there's something kind of in between that, which is enough management of yourself so that you don't spit it out. Management and not control. So you're not trying to repress it and not let it have a voice. You're trying to figure out how to have it let a voice that's actually fruitful.
Right. Feelings are information.
Yes, exactly.
And so they tell us something. The next step is, what do I do with that information? How do I reflect on it, turn it over in my own mind, and decide how to use it, how to put it to use one way or another, versus I'm identified with my feelings. So to go back to something you said earlier, Lisa, if I'm mad at my boss, absolutely walk right in there and start screaming. After all, I have a feeling.
Yeah, don't do that.
Oh, don't do that.
Try that at home.
But how to use all that we have and all that we are.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. I wouldn't say that Stoicism says this, but you could take it as an implication that you have to learn how to love your inner life. So even if we don't draw that just from Stoicism, which might be ambivalent with relation to that, I think it's something we need to draw probably from what we've talked about today. If you learn to love your inner life, you learn to cultivate it. If you're not trying to cultivate it, you're probably not loving it. You're probably trying to escape from it or something else is going on.
I really, really like that as a sort of a compass of what do you love? What goes on in you that you enjoy about yourself, that you love, that you find interesting, good, remarkable, beautiful, of orient to yourself with a feeling of love.
I think like Jung says, the face should turn to the unconscious, the unconscious turns to you. So the more you do that, the more I think, even when you run into those inner obstacles, which is so much a part of that second half analysis Jung talks about, when your adaptation's not so much to outer life, but to your own psychic structure, if you don't gain a love for that inner life, you're not going to go very far down that path.